Endurance. You will all know what I mean when I say that word. But what about fatigue resistance or durability? You can be forgiven for not knowing what it is, but this little known and often misunderstood aspect of performance is a cycling superpower. Is it, in fact, what underpins the biggest wins and the most incredible feats in professional cycling? Is it what separates gods from mortals? Well, in this video, with the help of a leading sports physiologist, we are going to explore what fatigue resistance is.
Power sustainability, if you want to call it like that, that would be a different way to express it.
And find out how it shapes professional cycling.
We know a lot of riders who can actually win bike races with 150k, but the closer we go to the 200-kilometer barrier, only a few can win.
And how it affects you.
It seems like there is a really important aspect in this for cycling performance.
For years, I thought that bike races were won by the fastest, strongest cyclists, those with the best power-to-weight ratios. But increasingly, I've come to realise that actually bike races are won by the rider who is the fastest, strongest and has the best power-to-weight ratio at the end of the race. It sounds pretty obvious. I'm sure you're all sat there screaming, duh, at me. I know. But it is a critical distinction because the best, the fastest, the strongest cyclists in the first hour of a race are not necessarily the best, fastest, strongest cyclists after 3, 4, or even 6 hours of riding. So what separates them? Potentially, it's fatigue resistance. To get a feel for what it is, imagine you go out for a ride and after 5 minutes you go up a hill as fast as you can. You get a PB, 3 minutes 30, for an average power of 300 watts. You then carry on riding hard for another 3 hours before coming back to your original hill and going up it again as fast as possible. Now, how much you slow down is an indication of your fatigue resistance. Now, if you don't slow down very much at all compared to your fresh state, you've got amazing fatigue resistance, but the slower you are, the worse your fatigue resistance is. Strangely, it is an aspect of physiology that's only really just being understood. Perhaps you'll see why in a moment, but actually there are still some fairly influential people who continue to dispute it.
I am yet to be convinced that durability is a unique physiological trait.
That was Dr. Andrew Coggan. He's the guy that invented FTP, and he thinks that fatigue resistance can actually simply be explained by looking instead at a rider's, you guessed it, FTP. Yeah, and maybe he's right. I mean, if we think back to our imaginary bike ride of 2 climbs separated by 3 hours, it's easy to see why, were you to have a higher FTP, the ride, if you kept the power the same, would be less demanding, and therefore you would be fresher at the end. So, potentially, there is something in it. But we'll find out in just a moment. To many of you, what I'm talking about might sound like good old-fashioned endurance, the ability to keep going for hours and hours, and to a certain extent it is. However, fatigue resistance is just one part of endurance. Now, to explain a little bit more, I spoke to Peter Leo, who's an Austrian sports scientist who now works for Jayco Alula and Oz Cycling. And he, to my mind at least, has sort of spearheaded the interest in this field with some particularly novel research.
So efficiency is another important determinant. And I think the main determinants were in an old framework, VO2 max, the threshold power or the fractional utilization, and your efficiency. And then you have a bit of anaerobic capacity. So that's kind of your traditional endurance framework. However, with that framework, we were not really able to characterize what is contemporary cycling performance. So that element of fatigue resistance was basically, or can be added to that framework as well as a kind of fourth dimension.
Contemporary cycling performance. Well, a good example of this would be the men's Tour of Flanders this year, so 2025. In the race, the riders tackle the fearsome cobbled climb of the Outer Quermont twice. The second time up it, Tadej Pogačar blasted everyone off his wheel. But what's interesting, though, is that 40 kilometres before, the first time they'd gone up it, he actually rode up the climb 12 seconds faster, and he still had 4 other riders with him. So yeah, after 210 kilometres, 5 riders were able to go up the Outer Quermont in 4 minutes and 29 seconds. After 250 kilometres though, only 1 rider was able to go up the Outer Quermont in 4 minutes and 41 seconds. So Tadej Pogačar, you could say, did not win Flanders by being faster than everyone else. He won the Tour of Flanders by getting less slower. He resisted the fatigue that had built up over 250 kilometres and 6,000 kilojoules of work better than anyone else. Now, you might say that using Tadej Pogačar as an example doesn't actually prove anything, because he was probably the fittest guy at the race anyway. He likely has the highest FTP, certainly the best power-to-weight ratio. But there were 2 very influential papers published fairly recently that showed that there is potentially a clear distinction between FTP, between VO2 max and any other physiological parameter you want to throw at it, and fatigue resistance. One of those papers was written by our new mate, Peter Leo. He tested a whole load of riders at the Tour of the Alps.
So we could actually had 3 different groups, and we could compare them to under 23s versus pros. And what we found is that in the fresh power profile, there was hardly any differences. However, when we looked after accumulated workload, so 1,500 kilojoule, 2,000 kilojoule, and so on, we actually saw, wow, there are actually big differences on, what these under 23 riders can do versus the pros.
These graphs tell the story. As Peter says, when fresh, there were no differences in what the riders were capable of. But the harder the race got, the bigger the differences became.
Now, you might think that age, of course, plays a part in this. We know that our endurance improves as we get older. But what's really interesting is that Peter's research also looked at rider type. And it's clear that there is a difference here as well. Meanwhile, that second piece of research that I mentioned from Van Erp et al. Looked at 85 seasons worth of data from 26 professional cyclists, but categorised them according to their performances. So they looked at Pro Cycling Stats rankings, and they accorded Cat 1 status to those riders that were in the top 15% of all professional cyclists, whereas the others, the remaining 85%, were given Cat 2 status. Again, you can clearly see that the harder the race, the bigger the difference between the best and the rest across their power profiles, from 10-second efforts right up to 20-minute efforts. I do wonder, though, that given this data comes from races, whether there is another element at play here. So if we look at Peter's research again, we can see that the riders with the best fatigue resistance are GC riders, so those riders that are capable of winning stage races. And those riders, almost by definition, have the best power-to-weight ratios over longer durations. They effectively have the highest FTPs. So is Andy Coggan actually right all along?
The threshold power is a very high explanatory variable in this construct, for sure. And you can generally say, especially when it comes down to climbing performance, that, the threshold power, as you put it, or 30-minute sustained power, is a very, very strong predictor of Grand Tour climbing performance. But, we have many races in the World Tour calendar that is not very predictive of a cycling stage. And I think the really interesting bit, what also surprised us, is actually good fatigue resistance is not really characterized by long sustained power output. It's more about the short end. Like, how good are you in the surges? Like, how deep can you go over 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes? Because I think from analyzing different World Tour stage race demands, we actually know from papers also with Dun van Erp and Deo Sanders and other colleagues that actually the short-term power output, like everything from 30 seconds, 10-second sprint to 5 minutes, is a very, very strong predictor of cycling performance, because these are the key moments where races are won, not over 20 minutes or so. Because even in a sustained climb, like, they go in a steady pace, but someone will do an acceleration, and it's those who can follow that acceleration, and then they ride back into a rhythm. So I would say the threshold power is for sure a very, very important determinant, and those with a higher threshold power tend to be obviously more fatigue resistant. But when they all have the same threshold power, it's still the one who can absorb those soldiers the best. I hope this makes sense in my explanations.
So that then raises an interesting question. If pro cyclists typically have similar power values when fresh, does that mean then that the biggest determinant of success is a rider's fatigue resistance? If you remember, we spoke to Andrew Coggan, the head of performance at Alpecin-de-Koning, about Pogačar Van der Poel, and he suggested that yes, it was.
Of course, he's a world-class rider, but he is not exceptional on the power outputs that he delivers in a fresh state. We have sometimes better riders in the team.
Now, I'm sure there must be something else here with Van der Poel. You don't end up with a 30-second lead after just 3 minutes of racing at the World Cyclocross Championships without having a bigger engine than your competitors. But there certainly seems to be something else, particularly when we're talking about those really, really long, hard races, like the Monuments, which he seems to be able to win almost at will. Which is why I asked Peter Leo, again, for his thoughts on this too. So do you think then that fatigue resistance is the biggest determinant of success after, a high FTP and a good anaerobic power? Is fatigue resistance the most important part?
I would say at the top level, yes, because you have already maximized your VO2 max pretty much, or utilized whatever you can push it, wherever you can push it, as well the threshold power. And it's more about then how often can you repeat it, or how often actually can you redo it. And I think with the fatigue resistance, it's kind of this new opportunity to look at it more even in depth and say, look, if they tick all these boxes on the top end, like how do we go around, just try to work on the repeatability of those elements.
So it seems like this fourth dimension of endurance performance might be the very thing that is responsible for winning the biggest, toughest bike races. Or, I should say, the biggest, toughest men's bike races. Because what's absolutely bananas is that the distance restriction placed on women's road racing by the UCI, and it is road racing, I should say, not gravel here, but road racing, means that arguably fatigue resistance plays a much smaller part in the outcome of those races, which is doubly weird when you think that actually women have consistently been shown to have much, much greater fatigue resistance than men. Now, we'll leave gender aside for a moment again, because there's a fundamental question that all this is raising in my mind now, which is why some riders have greater fatigue resistance than others. Of course, training is going to play a part. We'll come on to that in a moment. But when it comes to professional cyclists, broadly speaking, they all have the same opportunities available to them in terms of time to train, i.e. they have all the time. They have all the time to recover. They have basically the same access to top-level coaching or nutrition or whatever. And so if there is this incredible difference in fatigue resistance, surely then that must have a genetic component. Surely the best are born, therefore, and not made.
Nowadays, what we see in cycling, with I think the top 5 or 6 guys in the world who basically win every bike race as they want, I would say definitely there must be a difference to the rest. I think when you talk about a pro peloton in the World Tour, we talk already about a pretty pre-selected group compared to normal individuals. Because they're already so far outside our normal curve or distribution that it's really hard to quantify those. But even in that species, you have some really, really extraordinary riders, like those who just win everything and seem they can do everything and others cannot.
Potentially then, what separates the Pogačars and the Van der Poels from the rest is a genetic predisposition to greater fatigue resistance. Now, Peter does also point out that when it comes to bike racing, there are many, many other factors at play here, like a rider's bike handling ability or their efficiency in the peloton. The list goes on, and so it is never a case of black and white about physiology. But it does also make you think, this point, that if some pros naturally have a greater fatigue resistance than others, so too must some normal people, right? Some of us must also have greater fatigue resistance than others. And it makes you wonder whether you might have it too. I feel like we're a long way in now, but we still don't really know what durability looks like. What is it that makes one rider more durable than another, if VO2 and FTP and efficiency are all equal? I think the answer is probably that it's multifactorial, which sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but I think is true. It's going to encompass a lot of different things. It might be a rider's inhuman ability to absorb vast amounts of carbohydrate. It could be, speaking personally here, that someone is not a salty or heavy sweater. But actually, where the research is leading now, interestingly, seems to be pointing towards cadence.
Remember, power is a combination of your cadence, so how fast your pedals are moving around, multiplied by the force you're applying to them. From this new research, it seems like riders can continue to apply the same force to the pedals even when tired. But those with the best fatigue resistance are the ones who can maintain the cadence and therefore power. Now, this is interesting to me because it always feels like it is force production that's the limiting factor when exhausted. But no. And while it's not simply a case of correcting this by changing gear and increasing your cadence again, herein does lie a potential way of boosting your fatigue resistance, which we'll come on to in just a moment.
The question now, I think, is whether or not we can learn anything from pro cyclists, the people with the best fatigue resistance, and then apply it to whatever we might be doing, be that gravel racing or amateur road racing, or simply making sure that we've got something left in the tank for the last climb on that epic sportif we might be facing.
And again, it goes back on your race goal. Like if you prepare for a time trial, for a 20K time trial, then probably the question is not even, do you need much fatigue resistance? Because it just comes down to your event demands, or if you're a crit racer, you got to probably just really specify your training or racing goal first. But if you do a Grand Fondo, for sure, this is where sustained power output is very important to go over your day, where you accumulate multi-1,000 meters of elevation gain. That's very different. So it really depends on what you're choosing. But threshold power in general for an age grouper is the one go, and it's definitely, if you look for shortcuts, increasing your threshold power is the bang for your buck for sure for most of them. I would say 80 to 90%.
Wow, that's weird. We've come back to FTP.
It comes down to who you're talking to, you know? If you talk to a World Tour rider and you say, well, FTP, your FTP is the go-to, then he will probably look at you and say, well, my FTP is the same since 3, 4, 5 years, you know? So this is probably where you don't make enough wins anymore. You've got to look in other areas. However, a cyclist who just started cycling or in the first 2-3 years, obviously you want to maximize first, as I said initially, VO2, the VO2 max, their threshold power, so on and so on. And then later parts, when you have no further wins there, you switch more to another focus. I think it really depends on the context.
And what about just old school long rides? I mean,
nothing beats the long rides and nothing beats the kilojoule accumulation, I would say, because that's essentially what endurance training is made of.
So really then, the answer to fatigue resistance is both pleasingly simple and potentially frustrating at the same time. Simple because you simply need to get fitter and do long rides in order to improve, but also frustrating because actually not everyone can do long rides. We don't all have the time. And like all aspects of training, eventually you will reach a plateau. I did ask if there are any shortcuts, and the answer was no. However, strength training can potentially, as we've seen in previous videos, lead to short-term benefits. And if done consistently over time, those benefits can potentially also be extended out. And so whilst it is time efficient, I wouldn't say it's a shortcut. The other really interesting avenue, perhaps more for pro cyclists looking to push the envelope in every direction they can, is cadence manipulation in training. Now, this is something that's been done for years, but perhaps by framing it in the context of durability, we'll finally understand why it felt like it was beneficial, but yet we've never really been able to prove in what way it is beneficial. Anyway, I'd be super interested to hear your thoughts on all of this. Please get involved in the comments section down below. Give a big thumbs up, by the way, to Peter Leo. Thank you so much to him for his time and his expertise. We'll see you on the next one.